Hello, everyone. Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about A Christmas Carol. So we're about halfway through Stave 1. So we had got to this point here. So let's carry on. You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose, said Scrooge. So remember, he's talking to his clerk who wants the day off for Christmas the next day. Nowadays, we of course take that for granted, but in those days, it wasn't. It wasn't something you could take for granted. If quite convenient, sir. If it's not convenient, said Scrooge, and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill used, I'll be bound. So Scrooge is saying that it's not convenient, it's not fair, and that if I were to not pay you for tomorrow, you would think I was treating you unfairly. The clerk smiled faintly. And yet, said Scrooge, you don't think me ill used when I pay a day's wages for no work. So obviously for Christmas Day, you would be still paid even if you took the day off. But Scrooge feels that that's unfair. So obviously, this was well before the days when we had workers' rights, that kind of thing. The clerk observed that it was only once a year. A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December, said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning. Sorry, there should have been a paragraph here, so I've corrected that. Anyway, so here he's saying, oh, well, that's no excuse that to take money for not doing any work every year. And then he says, oh, well, I suppose you'll have to have the whole day. In that case, make sure that the day after Christmas, you're here even earlier. So Boxing Day, notice they would not have the day off the way we do now. The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide on Cornhill at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honour of its being Christmas Eve, and then he ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at blind man's buff. So let's just go back here. So twinkling means very quickly. Comforter, remember, means scarf. And this is just a literary way of saying that he had no coat. Went down a slide. So it's snowing, remember. So slide mean like literally, it's probably just some kind of a homemade slide, maybe a tray or something. So Cornhill is a street in London, along with other boys. So he did that 20 times, even though, I mean, he's a grown man, but he's a young man, but he's grown up, he's an adult. As we'll find out, he has a family, but it's Christmas Eve, he's having fun, and then he runs home to Camden Town. So notice he's running, he's not taking the bus or anything. So he lives in Camden, and pelt means to run quickly to play a game with his children. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. And then melancholy means sad. Tavern is an old word for pub. So he reads the papers, and then beguile means to charm or deceive, but in a charming way. But here it's just saying that he passed the time by looking at his accounting books. So obviously, very sad way of spending Christmas Eve. And then he goes home. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. So chambers means rooms or house, which had once belonged to old Marley, Jacob Marley. They were a gloomy suite of rooms. So suite means more than one. In a lowering pile of building up a yard where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide and seek with other houses, and forgotten the way out again. So the rooms were gloomy. This phrase here, we don't really know what that means. So, like with Dickens, Don't worry about if you don't understand every single line or word. It's a bit like Shakespeare in that sense, although Dickens is much easier to understand. But there are some words and phrases which even the experts don't fully understand. But that's okay, nothing to worry about. But what's important here is that Dickens is using personification again. So that's another technique that Dickens uses a lot. He's saying that this house doesn't seem to belong there. So maybe the other houses and the area is actually quite nice, but his rooms are gloomy. So it's as though they came there playing hide and seek and forgotten to leave again. It was old enough now and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. So dreary means dull, and all the other rooms are being let out as offices. So he's living in a place where you're not really supposed to live, because all the other. So at night it'll be empty. Nobody will be there, and I suppose that's quite important because it's more likely if there's no people around, you're going to see ghosts and things like that, and be more frightened of them. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. Okay, so fain can mean two things at least. It can be willing or glad, but it can also mean compelled or obliged. So here it means compelled. He was forced to feel the way with his hands because it was so dark. So you can see Dickens using lots of imagery and pathetic fallacy. So where you use the environment to create a mood. So Dickens is creating a dark, scary mood here, getting us ready for old Marley's ghost to appear. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. And then here Dickens uses a simile, so genius of the weather. Genius in, in ancient Roman so meant spirit, so the spirit of the weather, or I guess you could say God in a way, because you could say that God controls everything, including the weather. So mournful means sadness. So it's just using imagery here that the spirit of the weather was sitting sadly at the gateway of the house. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door except that it was very large. So the knocker on the door of Scrooge's house, which used to be Marley's house. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also, that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, alderman, and livery. So here, Dickens is emphasizing that Scrooge has seen this knocker every day, obviously, morning and night. And here he's implying that Scrooge doesn't have much of an imagination, okay? And that he was as unimaginative as everybody else in the city. So the corporation, these are the people who run the city of London. Aldermen are senior people in the city, just below the mayor. Livery normally means uniform, but it can also mean the people who wear the uniform, so servants and so on. So Dickens is being a bit, he's kind of insulting these people, okay? Because he doesn't like, well, not these people, but these people here. Um, and this is what's important here is that Dickens is foreshadowing what's going to happen next because Scrooge is going to see Marley's face on the knocker. Okay, this is why he's going on about this knocker because you might be wondering why on earth is he just going on about this simple knocker on the door. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And this born here means to bear in mind. So Dickens is saying, bear in mind that Scrooge had not once thought about Marley, except for the afternoon when the gentleman came to get money from him. He had not thought about Marley for 7 years since then. Okay. So again, this is very important because we don't want Dickens doesn't want the reader to think that Marley was on Scrooge's mind. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without his undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Okay, so it was all leading up to this. So intermediate means in between. So suddenly he sees Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not an impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. So impenetrable means something that you can't go through. So so Dickens is just saying that he could see Marley's face fairly clearly, and dismal means, if you remember, sad and gloomy. And here Dickens is using a simile. He was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. So ferocious means wild and angry. And this is how he's just describing how his glasses used to be on his forehead, Marley's. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. So his hair was kind of all over the place, as though the wind had ruffled it, had messed it up a bit, and the eyes were wide open, so that's fairly straightforward. That and its livid color made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. So livid means very angry, so again another word like ferocious. Um, and so he's talking about the eyes are full of kind of anger, but it's as though it's beyond its control. It's not part of the face. There's a horror in the eyes which the face is unable to control. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. So phenomenon means something exceptional that happens, and it's turned now back to being a knocker again. The face has disappeared. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. Okay, so here he's saying that Scrooge was surprised. Startled means surprised and shocked, and he feels like a terrible sensation which he hasn't felt since childhood, since he was young. Okay, but then he relinquish means to let go. So maybe he's holding the key in his pocket. He had let it go. He holds it again. Sturdily means strongly. So he opens the door, walks in, and lights his candle. He did pause with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on, so he said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed it with a bang. Okay, so he, he pauses for a moment. So this means undecided. And then he looks behind the door, expecting to see Marley's pigtail. So pigtail is where you tie all your hair at the back in one bit. So we can assume that Marley had long hair, not that it matters really. But he doesn't see anything except the screws and the nuts that are holding the knocker in place. So he says poo poo and closes the door with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. So resound means to echo, like thunder is a simile. Cask is the container where you put wine. And basically, this is all poetic ways of saying that the whole house echoed, but Scrooge doesn't get frightened of echoes. So he closes the door. Trimming the candle means you cutting the wick, the bit at the top that's actually a light. There are various reasons for doing that. It just makes the candle burn brighter, but we don't need to worry about that. You can research that yourself if you want. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs or through a bad young Act of Parliament. But I mean to say, you might have got a hearse up that staircase and taken it broadwise, with the splinter bar towards the wall and the door towards the balustrades, and done it easy. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Okay, so coach and six means a coach and six horses. So remember, in those days there were no cars or anything, and through a bad young act of parliament. So this is just a metaphor and a bit of humor. Basically, what Dickens is trying to say is that the staircase was very wide. You could get a hearse up it. So a hearse is a vehicle that you use to take a dead body, and yeah, balustrades are banisters, the wooden things on the sides of a staircase. So all of this is saying that the staircase was very wide. Locomotive, it means a vehicle that moves. So remember, in those days there were no cars, but there were trains, or like trains, trains pulled by steam engines. Okay, so he's saying that it was as though the hearse was being pulled by a steam engine. And here it's just repeating, Dickens is just repeating that it was very dark, and dip is just referring to his candle. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. And then here, Dickens is just repeating how stingy Scrooge is, but he can still remember Marley's face, so he kind of looks around the rooms to make sure that everything's okay. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel, Scrooge had a cold in his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fire guard, old shoes, two fish baskets, washing stand on three legs, and a poker. Okay, so lumber room is where they used to store old furniture. They wouldn't they wouldn't get rid of it. They wouldn't just throw it away. They would store it there. Grate is where you make the fire under the chimney. Gruel is like porridge. Hob is like the cooker, and that's all fine. Fire guard, so like a metal thing you would put in front of the fire for safety reasons. Fish basket is not where you store fish, but it's a device for catching fish. And here, this is where you would put your washing up to dry, and a poker is a metal rod for the fire to stoke the fire, to stoke the fire. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in, double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Oh, by the way, up here, suspicious. So the dressing gown, suspicious attitude. So obviously personification going on there, and still suggesting that Scrooge is still feeling a bit scared, a bit shocked from what he saw earlier. And this also shows that he's feeling a bit scared. So he's double locked the room, which he doesn't normally do. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers, and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire, to take his gruel. Okay, so cravat means is an old word for tie, although it means something slightly different now, like a bigger tie. And nightcap nowadays means a drink before you have go to sleep, but in those days literally meant a nightcap. So it would be a cap that you wore in bed because people were cold in those days. There was no central heating. The houses were not very warm, so people would wear a hat in bed to keep themselves warm because most of your heat escapes from your head. And he sits down to eat his porridge. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all round with quaint Dutch tiles designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers, descending through the air on clouds like feather beds. Abraham's, Belshazzar's, apostles, putting off to sea in butter boats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. And yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blank at first, with power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one. Okay, so this paragraph is quite rich. We won't go through in too much detail, but I think it is worth going through because it's quite interesting and it's important to show Scrooge's state of mind. So anyway, he's sitting there by a small fire, and the fireplace is an old one. Quaint means attractive in an unusual way. So Dutch means from Holland, and the fireplace is designed in such a way to show pictures from the Bible. Okay, so Cain and Abel were two brothers, the first children of Adam and Eve. Pharaoh's daughters, so pharaohs were the rulers of ancient Egypt, queens of Sheba, angelic, so angels, and then Abraham was one of the ancient prophets. He started Judaism. Belshazzar was an ancient prince. Apostles means prophets. Okay, so all of these pictures were on the fireplace, but Scrooge doesn't see any of them. All he sees is the face of Marley. Okay, and this reference here, the ancient prophet's rod, so this is referring to and swallowed up the whole. This is referring to the story of Moses and Aaron from the Bible, and so what happened was that Moses and Aaron were commanded by God to go to the Pharaoh to Egypt. He didn't listen to them. He didn't believe in them, and so Moses and Aaron they did some miracles. So they threw down their rod and became a serpent. But the Pharaoh called his magicians, and they did something similar. But then Aaron's rod, Moses and Aaron's rod, their serpent swallowed up all the other serpents, so to show that their power was stronger. Anyway, we don't need to worry too much about that. But this is a metaphor that the face of Marley is swallowing up all the other images, is taking over all the other images in Scrooge's mind. And he's saying that even if all the tiles had been smooth, they would have created pictures of old Marley's head. Humbug, said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room and communicated, for some purpose now forgotten, with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. Okay, anyway, so he sits down, and then he looks up at this bell, which hasn't been used for a long time. So in those days, they used to have bells connected by strings with other parts of the house to communicate, okay, instead of phones. And high story, so this means floor, should really be spelled with an EY. This spelling is normally American, but anyway, let's not worry about that. And the bell begins to ring. So initially quite softly, but then loudly, and then every bell in the house starts to ring by itself. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. Okay, so this paragraph is straightforward. The bells stop ringing. Uh, Clanking, what kind of a word is that? Onomatopoeia. Okay. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. And now he heard the noise coming up. It's humbug still, said Scrooge. I won't believe it. His colour changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leapt up as though it cried, I know him, Marley's ghost, and fell again. But then his colour changes because as the noise and whatever is making the noise comes in, the flame, the fire, which had almost died out, comes to life as though, and obviously personification being used here, as though to say, I know him. So the fire blazes up again, and as if to say, I know that this is Marley's ghost, and then the fire dies back again. Okay, what we'll do is we'll stop there and we'll go on to the next video, the next part of this Stave 1. But just before we go, as always, if you found this video useful, please do subscribe and tell all your friends about it. And I'll see you in the next video where we'll carry on with Stave 1 of A Christmas Carol.